No More Tears. This video is based on key insights from the book No More Tears by Gardiner Harris. Introduction: a quintessentially American company. Gardiner Harris begins his investigation with a seemingly ordinary encounter at Chicago's O'Hare Airport in 2004. While waiting for a flight, he met a pharmaceutical sales representative from Johnson & Johnson, a company widely considered a symbol of American trustworthiness. This chance meeting sparked a years-long quest to uncover a hidden side of the healthcare giant. The woman, a passionate college basketball fan, shared a troubling story about her nephew. He had been prescribed Risperdal, a powerful drug for schizophrenia, after a schoolyard fight, despite appearing perfectly healthy. This initial anecdote became the seed for Harris's exploration into the company's practices. The sales rep's story revealed a disturbing pattern. She described how she'd happily supplied her doctor friends with samples of Risperdal, earning bonuses based on their prescriptions. They were her whales, doctors who wrote a lot of prescriptions. She'd even been rewarded with gifts for promoting the drug. However, she grew increasingly uneasy as her nephew gained weight and withdrew socially while taking Risperdal. She also learned that Johnson & Johnson was downplaying the drug's potential side effects, like diabetes, even as evidence emerged to the contrary. This internal conflict, and her eventual decision to quit, fueled Harris's suspicion that something was deeply wrong within the company. Harris contrasts this troubling reality with Johnson & Johnson's carefully cultivated public image. He points out the company's consistent recognition as one of the most admired corporations in the world, even being compared to Coca-Cola in its widespread influence. The company's credo, prominently displayed at its headquarters, emphasizes prioritizing patient well-being over profits. This commitment to ethics, exemplified by its handling of the 1982 Tylenol poisoning crisis, had cemented Johnson & Johnson's reputation as a responsible and caring corporation. Harris notes that the Tylenol crisis, where capsules were laced with cyanide, was handled so well it became a case study in business schools, showing how doing the right thing can build customer loyalty. However, Harris's own experiences covering the pharmaceutical industry, beginning in 1999, revealed a different side of Johnson & Johnson. He found the company unusually secretive, often refusing to provide even basic information. This secrecy, combined with the story from the airport, led him to believe that the company's public persona was a carefully constructed facade. He began to suspect a significant disconnect between the company's stated values and its actual practices. He highlights the company's refusal to share patents for HIV/AIDS medicines with a United Nations program aimed at saving lives in Africa as an early example of this contradiction. The author explains that uncovering the truth about Johnson & Johnson was a long and difficult process, taking 5 years of research and involving tens of thousands of documents, trial transcripts, and interviews. He acknowledges the risk taken by his sources, who provided confidential grand jury files, risking criminal charges to expose the company's actions. Harris decided to focus on 9 specific Johnson & Johnson products to tell the company's complex story, rather than attempting a single, chronological narrative. He emphasizes the importance of understanding the roles played by the Food and Drug Administration, the media, and the American professional class, doctors, researchers, and academics, in enabling the company's behavior. Ultimately, Harris argues that Johnson & Johnson's story is a microcosm of larger problems within the American healthcare system, government, and economy. He suggests that the company's actions challenge the common belief in the fairness and equity of these systems. He concludes that Johnson & Johnson's story is, in fact, the quintessential American story, embodying both the promise and the perils of American capitalism. Section 1, Trust from Birth. Gardiner Harris begins his investigation into Johnson & Johnson by revealing the surprising strength of the company's image. For generations, products like Johnson's baby powder and Tylenol haven't just been things people buy. They've been symbols of comfort and trust. Harris explains that this wasn't accidental. Johnson & Johnson deliberately worked to create a strong emotional connection with customers, building a protective halo around their brand. The author details how much effort went into even the scent of baby powder, with over 200 ingredients carefully chosen to create a fragrance that would evoke pleasant memories. This wasn't just about making a nice smell. It was about linking the product to feelings of love, happiness, and security. Harris shows how Johnson & Johnson understood the power of this emotional connection. Internal company documents, like presentations from 1999 and 2008, reveal that executives believed their brand had something special: emotional trust. While other companies might earn trust through reliable products, Johnson & Johnson had tapped into something deeper, associating their name with the powerful bond between a mother and her baby. The author points out that this golden egg, as the company called it, wasn't just good for feelings. It was good for business. Johnson & Johnson believed that this trust would allow them to weather any problems or mistakes. Harris illustrates this with the example of the 1982 Tylenol poisoning crisis, which the company handled in a way that became a case study in crisis management. The narrative then shifts back in time, tracing the company's origins to the mid-19th century. Harris introduces the three Johnson brothers, Robert, James, and Edward, and their journey from medicinal plasters to a global healthcare giant. The author describes how Robert, initially protected from the Civil War, learned the trade of making medicinal patches. After a partnership with George Seabury, the brothers eventually struck out on their own, founding Johnson & Johnson in New Brunswick, New Jersey, in 1887. Harris emphasizes the brothers' dedication to innovation, particularly James's work with rubber to create more effective bandages. Gardiner Harris highlights the importance of advertising and marketing in the company's early success. He explains how Johnson recognized the value of partnering with Dr. Fred B. Kilmer, who created a book catalog that combined helpful medical advice with product promotion. This approach, Harris notes, became a model for Johnson & Johnson's marketing for decades. The author also details the company's quick response to national emergencies, like the Spanish-American War and the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, providing medical supplies and demonstrating a commitment to public service. This further cemented their image as a caring and responsible company. The author then focuses on Robert Wood Johnson II, the grandson of the founder, and his significant impact on the company's growth and culture. Harris portrays Johnson II as a demanding and meticulous leader who valued cleanliness, order, and ethical conduct. He describes Johnson II's efforts to create a beautiful and efficient work environment, even down to the smallest details. Harris also explains Johnson II's decision to decentralize the company, creating a family of independent subsidiaries. The author notes that Johnson II resisted entering the pharmaceutical business for a long time, concerned about the industry's reputation, but eventually acquired McNeil Laboratories and Janssen Pharmaceutica, which led to the development of blockbuster drugs like Tylenol and Haldol. Harris reveals a complicated relationship between Johnson II and his son, Bobby. Despite Bobby's desire to follow in his father's footsteps, the two men struggled to connect. The author details how Johnson II ultimately bypassed Bobby in the succession plan, appointing Philip Hoffman as CEO. Bobby's eventual resignation marked the end of family leadership at Johnson & Johnson. The author concludes this section by noting Johnson II's philanthropic legacy, with much of his wealth going to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Harris sets the stage for a deeper exploration of the company's later challenges, hinting at tragedies and scandals that would test the very trust Johnson & Johnson had so carefully cultivated. Section 2. Johnson's Baby Powder. Gardiner Harris meticulously details in this chapter how Johnson & Johnson, a company built on a reputation of trust, knowingly put consumers at risk for decades. The story begins with the seemingly harmless substance, talc, used in everything from baby powder to cosmetics. However, Harris reveals a dark secret. Talc is often contaminated with asbestos, a known cancer-causing material. The chapter traces the growing awareness of this danger, starting with early reports in the 1920s of babies suffocating from inhaled talc, and escalating through decades of research linking talc and asbestos to serious lung diseases and cancers. The narrative highlights a pattern of behavior from Johnson & Johnson. Despite internal knowledge of the asbestos contamination, the company consistently downplayed the risks, funded misleading research, and actively worked to discredit scientists who raised concerns. For example, when researchers discovered asbestos in their talc, J&J didn't immediately stop selling the product. Instead, they hired their own scientists to try and disprove the findings, and even attempted to influence the FDA's testing standards to make it harder to detect asbestos. This is a classic tactic of companies prioritizing profit over public safety, as Harris illustrates. Harris emphasizes the tragic case of the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster in West Virginia, where thousands of mostly African American workers were exposed to deadly silica dust while building a hydroelectric power plant. This event, though involving silica rather than talc, serves as a chilling example of how companies can exploit workers and conceal dangerous conditions for financial gain. It sets the stage for understanding J&J's later actions. The author points out that the company's Vermont talc mines were located near asbestos mines, making complete separation of the two minerals virtually impossible. Yet J&J continued to claim its products were asbestos-free. The chapter dives into the FDA's role, or rather, its lack of robust oversight. Harris explains how the agency, hampered by limited resources and industry pressure, repeatedly accepted J&J's assurances about the safety of its talc, even when evidence suggested otherwise. The FDA initially proposed strict testing standards for asbestos in talc, but the cosmetic industry, led by J&J, successfully lobbied to weaken those standards, ultimately adopting a testing method that was demonstrably ineffective at detecting asbestos. This illustrates how powerful companies can manipulate regulations to protect their bottom line. Harris details how J&J actively suppressed unfavorable research. When a researcher, Arthur Langer, discovered both talc and asbestos in Johnson's baby powder, the company discouraged him from publishing his findings. J&J even funded studies designed to discredit research linking talc to ovarian cancer, going so far as to hire a doctor with a history of unethical experimentation on vulnerable populations. This demonstrates a deliberate effort to manipulate the scientific narrative and protect the company's image. The author reveals a disturbing pattern of internal memos and communications within J&J, showing that executives were aware of the asbestos contamination and the potential health risks for decades. Yet, they continued to market and sell talc-based products, prioritizing profits over the well-being of their customers. The story culminates with the FDA's eventual ban on chrysotile asbestos in 2024, a decision that came far too late for countless individuals who developed cancer after years of using J&J's products. Through careful documentation and compelling storytelling, Harris paints a picture of a company that betrayed the trust of millions, prioritizing profits over people. Gardiner Harris details in this chapter how Johnson & Johnson, a company once seen as a symbol of trust, actively worked to hide dangers linked to its iconic baby powder. The story unfolds as a battle between scientists raising concerns about asbestos contamination and J&J's determined efforts to protect its brand and profits. It began in the 1970s when researchers started finding asbestos, a dangerous substance known to cause cancer, in talc, the main ingredient in baby powder. J&J didn't just disagree with these findings. Harris shows how the company actively discredited the scientists and regulators who raised alarms, viewing them with suspicion and even hostility. The author explains how J&J created a strategy to undermine those questioning the safety of its product. A memo from a J&J executive listed scientists like Dr. Irving Selikoff and Dr. Arthur Langer as antagonistic personalities, essentially labeling them as enemies. This wasn't just about disagreeing with science, it was about controlling the narrative. Harris illustrates this with the story of Dr. Langer, whose personal life tragically suffered as J&J's pressure mounted. His wife was diagnosed with cancer during this time, and he felt pulled between his work and family, highlighting the human cost of the company's actions. Harris reveals a disturbing pattern of manipulation. When scientists presented evidence of asbestos in talc at conferences, J&J pressured them to withdraw their findings. One scientist, Fred Pooley, was persuaded to discredit his own research after J&J executives threatened him. This demonstrates how far the company was willing to go to suppress unfavorable information. The author emphasizes that J&J didn't just want to disprove the science, they wanted to silence the scientists themselves. The chapter details how J&J attempted to control the media, too. When a Washington Post reporter, Marion Burroughs, published a story about the asbestos findings, J&J quickly contacted the reporter and other news outlets, claiming the tested samples were old and not representative of their current product. This is a classic tactic of public relations, attempting to discredit information by questioning its source or relevance. Harris points out that Burroughs, unlike many other journalists, persisted in seeking the truth, interviewing Selikoff and challenging J&J's claims. Harris shows how J&J exerted pressure on Mount Sinai Hospital, demanding they issue a statement declaring baby powder safe, even after their own scientists found asbestos in recent samples. This is a particularly troubling example of corporate influence, as it involved pressuring a respected medical institution to compromise its scientific integrity. The author notes that such actions are extremely rare, highlighting the extraordinary lengths J&J went to. The hospital ultimately caved, issuing a statement that downplayed the risks, effectively selling out Dr. Langer and his team. The narrative then shifts to James Burke, who became J&J's CEO and learned from the talc controversy. Burke understood the importance of controlling the message and significantly limited the company's interactions with the press. Harris suggests that this decision was a direct result of the negative publicity surrounding the talc issue. Burke also focused on expanding J&J's pharmaceutical business, a move that would later lead to other controversies. The author then details how Engelhard, the company that bought J&J's Vermont talc mine, also discovered asbestos contamination but attempted to cover it up. This reinforces the idea that the problem wasn't just with J&J. It was a systemic issue within the industry. Harris explains how Engelhard destroyed evidence and provided false assurances to customers, mirroring J&J's tactics. Harris reveals a pattern of deceit that continued for decades. J&J continued to sell talc-based baby powder, even after internal documents showed it contained asbestos. The author highlights how the company repeatedly dismissed concerns, manipulated testing results, and pressured scientists and regulators. The FDA, the government agency responsible for ensuring product safety, was often slow to act, and sometimes seemed to be influenced by J&J's lobbying efforts. The chapter culminates with the Engam case, a landmark lawsuit that exposed J&J's decades-long cover-up. Harris describes how Lanier, the plaintiff's attorney, presented compelling evidence of asbestos contamination and J&J's deliberate attempts to hide it. The jury awarded a massive $4.14 billion in punitive damages, sending a strong message that the company would be held accountable. Harris concludes by noting that J&J's actions have led to countless lawsuits and a tarnished reputation, demonstrating the long-term consequences of prioritizing profits over public health. The author's detailed account paints a picture of a company that betrayed the trust of millions of consumers. Section 3, Tylenol. Gardiner Harris details how the 1982 Tylenol crisis, initially seen as a tragic but isolated event, reveals a pattern of questionable decisions and a troubling relationship between Johnson & Johnson and the Food and Drug Administration. While the company is often praised for its swift recall after 7 people died from cyanide-laced capsules, Harris argues this narrative overlooks earlier tampering incidents and a delayed, calculated response. J&J had already received hundreds of complaints about contaminated products, suggesting they were aware of the potential for issues and were considering tamper-resistant packaging before the crisis even began. The initial recall wasn't comprehensive. It focused only on specific lots, even after reports of copycat poisoning surfaced, demonstrating a reluctance to fully address the problem until public panic forced their hand. The author explains that the investigation was complicated by the fact that Johnson & Johnson didn't distribute directly to most stores. They used rack jobbers, companies that stocked shelves for retailers. This created a potential weak point in the supply chain, and Harris suggests the company downplayed this aspect to avoid responsibility. A crucial clue, boxes of tampered Tylenol found in a parking lot before the deaths, was largely ignored by investigators, further highlighting the flawed initial approach. Harris points out that police focused on retail stores, aligning with J&J's narrative, rather than investigating potential breaches within the distribution network. Harris introduces Roger Arnold, a former Jewel Company employee, as a strong suspect. Arnold had a history of anger, access to cyanide, and bragged about harming people. Evidence linked him to stores where contaminated Tylenol was sold, and he even possessed manuals on making explosives and poisons. However, the FBI focused on James Lewis, who sent an extortion letter despite doubts from local police. Harris suggests the FBI's pursuit of Lewis was partly driven by a desire to maintain control of the investigation and avoid scrutiny of their initial handling of the case. The author reveals a deeply concerning dynamic between Johnson & Johnson and the FDA. He details how Arthur Hayes, the FDA commissioner during the crisis, had undisclosed financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry, creating a conflict of interest. Hayes quickly exonerated J&J and downplayed the need for stricter regulations, even as evidence emerged of potential problems. Harris argues that this close relationship allowed J&J to influence the narrative and avoid full accountability. Harris then shifts focus to the ongoing dangers of acetaminophen, the active ingredient in Tylenol. Despite knowing about the risk of liver damage, especially when combined with alcohol, J&J continued to market extra-strength Tylenol aggressively. The author explains that the company resisted adding stronger warnings to the label, fearing it would scare away customers. He highlights the tragic case of Brianna Hutto, a baby who died from an accidental overdose due to confusing dosing instructions for infant and children's Tylenol. Despite recommendations from experts to simplify the formulations, the FDA failed to act decisively. The author concludes by illustrating how J&J prioritized profits over safety, even when aware of the potential for harm. He describes how the company secretly researched safer formulations, but shelved them, fearing it would acknowledge the risks of their existing product. Harris emphasizes that the FDA's reluctance to challenge J&J allowed these practices to continue, demonstrating a pattern of regulatory capture where the industry exerts undue influence over its regulators. The narrative suggests that for Johnson & Johnson, maintaining a positive image and protecting its bottom line often outweighed the responsibility to ensure the safety of its customers. Section 4, Procrit. Gardiner Harris details a dramatic shift within the pharmaceutical industry, focusing on Johnson & Johnson's transformation and the troubling consequences that followed. The story begins with a golden age of medicine, starting around the 1890s with inventions like aspirin and reaching its peak in the 1980s. Back then, new drugs were constantly being developed, helping people live longer and healthier lives. Medicines for heart problems, indigestion, and even mental health became common, and with good health insurance, people could afford them. This created a very profitable situation for drug companies like Pfizer and Merck, who were seen as innovative leaders, much like tech companies are today. However, this success led Johnson & Johnson to change how it did business. Instead of selling directly to customers, the company began focusing on doctors. To get doctors to prescribe their drugs, J&J hired large teams of sales representatives who offered gifts, meals, and even money. This was a big change from the company's earlier, more conservative style. But just as things seemed perfect, the flow of new drug discoveries slowed down significantly in the mid-1990s. Labs that once produced blockbuster drugs suddenly couldn't come up with anything new, despite spending more and more money on research. Around the year 2000, scientists mapped the human genome, opening the door to a new era of gene-based medicine. This meant drugs would be designed to treat very rare, specific genetic diseases, often for only a small number of patients and at incredibly high prices. This shift created a crisis for companies like Johnson & Johnson, who were running out of new products to sell. To keep profits up, they started raising prices and trying to get more people to take their drugs. Harris explains that raising prices was easier, especially because insurance companies were paying the bills. The introduction of generic drugs in 1984, through the Hatch-Waxman Act, complicated things. Generic drugs are cheaper copies of brand-name drugs, and they forced big pharmaceutical companies to constantly innovate to avoid losing money when patents expired. Managed care organizations, which negotiate prices with drug companies on behalf of insurers, also started pushing back against high prices. To counter this, drug companies began advertising directly to consumers, urging them to ask their doctor about new medications, a practice allowed in only the United States and New Zealand. However, the biggest influence remained persuading doctors. Harris details how drug companies began pushing the boundaries of ethical marketing, offering doctors increasingly lavish incentives. This is where the story turns to erythropoietin, or EPO, a drug developed by Amgen and partnered with Johnson & Johnson. EPO was initially intended to help kidney patients avoid blood transfusions, but the company quickly realized its potential to treat anemia in cancer patients. While EPO could help patients feel stronger, it also thickened the blood, increasing the risk of heart attacks and strokes. The author reveals troubling information about internal research, showing EPO could actually promote cancer growth. Despite these concerns, Johnson & Johnson pushed ahead, downplaying the risks and focusing on potential benefits. Harris points out that the FDA, influenced by the success of biotechnology and facing political pressure, approved EPO with minimal safety testing. This set a dangerous precedent, allowing the company to market the drug widely before fully understanding its potential harms. The narrative then dives into the tactics used to influence doctors. Harris describes a system of payments, gifts, and consulting fees designed to encourage doctors to prescribe drugs, even when it wasn't in the patient's best interest. He explains how sales representatives were rewarded for increasing prescriptions, and how doctors were offered lucrative opportunities to speak at conferences or conduct research, often with biased results. The author highlights the story of Dr. Albert Kligman, a researcher with a history of unethical practices who was involved in promoting Retin-A, a drug initially approved for acne as an anti-wrinkle treatment. Harris details how Johnson & Johnson illegally promoted Retin-A for uses not approved by the FDA, and then attempted to cover up evidence of wrongdoing. The company eventually paid a fine, but the incident demonstrated a willingness to prioritize profits over patient safety. The author emphasizes that the FDA, increasingly reliant on funding from the drug industry, became less willing to challenge companies like Johnson & Johnson. This created a system where drug companies could essentially police themselves, leading to widespread ethical abuses and potentially harmful consequences for patients. The chapter concludes by illustrating how doctors, facing increasing pressures in their profession, became susceptible to the influence of pharmaceutical companies, further blurring the lines between medical care and marketing. Gardiner Harris details how Procrit, a drug made by Johnson & Johnson, became the company's biggest moneymaker, despite growing evidence it was dangerous. By 1998, Procrit was bringing in huge profits, and by 2001, it made up over 10% of Johnson & Johnson's total sales. Doctors who treated cancer were really enthusiastic about the drug, and it even became the single most expensive healthcare cost for the US government. The problem was, even as doctors used it more and more, they knew it could cause heart problems, and there were growing concerns it could actually help cancer grow faster. Harris explains that Johnson & Johnson knew about these risks, but instead of stopping the drug's use, they downplayed them. They told doctors they were still studying the drug's safety, suggesting that if it was harmful, they would have stopped the study already. This gave doctors a false sense of security. Meanwhile, a similar drug made by another company, Amgen, had completed a much larger and more thorough study years earlier. That study actually showed the drug was dangerous, increasing the risk of death, but even Amgen presented the results in a way that made the drug seem safer than it was. They used tricky statistics and even removed information from the published study that showed the drug didn't actually help patients feel better. The author highlights a specific example of how Amgen manipulated information. A study called the Normal Hematocrit trial found that patients getting higher doses of the drug were dying at a higher rate and didn't feel any better. But when the study was published, the researchers, who had connections to Amgen, claimed the higher dose wasn't linked to higher death rates. They even admitted later that someone had removed the part of the study that showed the drug didn't improve quality of life. This shows how companies can control the narrative, even when the science tells a different story. Harris then describes how Johnson & Johnson launched a massive advertising campaign for Procrit, claiming it was a natural way to regain energy lost during chemotherapy. This was misleading because the drug wasn't natural at all, it was a man-made protein. The ads also downplayed the risks, saying only minor side effects had been reported. The Food and Drug Administration, FDA, the government agency responsible for ensuring drug safety, tried to stop the ads, but Johnson & Johnson was skilled at delaying and arguing, allowing the misleading ads to run for a long time. The situation got worse when President George W. Bush appointed a lawyer, Daniel Troy, to a top position at the FDA. Troy had spent years defending drug companies' right to make broad claims about their drugs, and he had received millions of dollars in donations from the pharmaceutical industry. Once in office, Troy made it much harder for the FDA to challenge misleading drug advertising, effectively giving companies free rein to promote their products. Harris points out that Troy later became a lawyer for Johnson & Johnson, demonstrating a clear conflict of interest. Even with all these issues, Johnson & Johnson continued to conduct studies that showed Procrit was dangerous. One study in cervical cancer patients was stopped early because patients getting the drug were dying faster. But the company secretly analyzed the results for 4 years before finally sending the data to the FDA, and never published the study. This pattern of secrecy and manipulation allowed doctors to continue prescribing the drug, even as the risks became clearer. The author introduces Dr. Michael Henk, a researcher who finally broke the silence. In 2003, Henk published a study showing that EPO, the type of drug Procrit is, might actually be killing cancer patients. This was a shocking finding, and initially, many experts cautioned against taking it seriously. But another researcher, Paul Goldberg, uncovered evidence that Henk's study wasn't an isolated case. He found a hidden report showing similar results in a breast cancer trial, and learned that other studies had been quietly stopped because of safety concerns. Harris details Henk's journey, explaining how he initially became interested in EPO and how his own research led him to the disturbing conclusion that the drug was harmful. He describes the difficult decision Henk faced in publishing his findings, knowing it would challenge the established view and potentially harm the company that had funded his research. Henk's bravery was crucial in bringing the truth to light. The author explains how the financial incentives in the healthcare system played a huge role in the EPO disaster. Doctors and hospitals made a lot of money from prescribing and administering the drug, and this influenced their decisions. Johnson & Johnson and Amgen even engaged in illegal practices, like giving doctors kickbacks and overfilling drug vials to increase sales. Harris emphasizes that while most doctors are honest, financial incentives can unconsciously influence their behavior. Ultimately, Harris argues that the EPO story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked corporate power and the importance of independent research. He points out that the same problems are happening with other drugs, and that the American healthcare system needs to be reformed to prioritize patient safety over profits. The author concludes that the EPO disaster resulted in the deaths of potentially hundreds of thousands of people, and that the lack of accountability for Johnson & Johnson and Amgen is a tragedy. Section 5, Risperdal. Gardiner Harris details in these chapters how Johnson & Johnson, a company many Americans trusted, began a troubling journey with its drug Risperdal. The story unfolds as a quest for profit that overshadowed patient safety and ethical behavior. The initial problem was simple. Their older antipsychotic drug, Haldol, was losing patent protection, meaning other companies could soon make cheaper versions. Johnson & Johnson needed a replacement, and Risperdal was it, but it wasn't necessarily better than Haldol. The author explains that antipsychotics are used for serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia, helping people who experience hallucinations or delusions, seeing or believing things that aren't real. While these drugs can help, they often have unpleasant side effects like weight gain, sleepiness, and even uncontrollable movements. Harris points out that for many people, Risperdal didn't even work well or caused side effects that were too difficult to handle. This is a crucial point. The drug wasn't a miracle cure, but Johnson & Johnson acted as if it was. Harris reveals that the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, initially resisted Johnson & Johnson's claims about Risperdal. The FDA wanted solid proof that it was better than Haldol, and the company couldn't provide it. They tried to compare Risperdal to Haldol in a way that made Risperdal look better, but the FDA saw through this tactic. Despite this, Johnson & Johnson was determined to make Risperdal a blockbuster drug, a drug that would earn billions of dollars. The author highlights a disturbing trend: the high cost of newer antipsychotics like Risperdal. These drugs were incredibly expensive, and state Medicaid programs, which provide health care for low-income people, ended up spending a huge amount of money on them. In some cases, states had to cut other health care services because they were spending so much on these drugs. This meant that people who needed other types of care were suffering because of the high cost of Risperdal. Harris details how Johnson & Johnson expanded the use of Risperdal beyond schizophrenia, even though it hadn't been approved for other conditions. They developed a marketing strategy called "sell to the symptoms," where sales representatives would encourage doctors to prescribe Risperdal for any symptom listed on a broad scale used to measure mental illness. This meant the drug was being marketed for things like anxiety or impulsiveness, even though it wasn't proven to be effective or safe for those conditions. It was, as Harris makes clear, a way to dramatically expand the market for the drug. The author explains that Johnson & Johnson also targeted vulnerable populations like the elderly and children. They created a special sales force to market Risperdal to doctors who treated older adults, even though studies showed the drug could be dangerous for this group. They also aggressively promoted the drug for use in children, despite concerns about its effects on their developing bodies. Harris emphasizes that this was particularly troubling because these groups were often less able to advocate for themselves. Harris reveals a shocking practice. Johnson & Johnson paid kickbacks to Omnicare, a large pharmacy benefit manager that handled prescriptions for many nursing homes. This meant that Omnicare was incentivized to push Risperdal on nursing home residents, even if it wasn't the best option for them. The author points out that this practice was illegal and undermined the purpose of the law designed to protect patients in nursing homes. Throughout these chapters, Harris paints a picture of a company prioritizing profits over people. Johnson & Johnson knew Risperdal wasn't a miracle drug, but they used deceptive marketing tactics and illegal schemes to sell it to as many people as possible. The author's detailed reporting exposes a dark side of the pharmaceutical industry and raises serious questions about the ethics of drug companies and their responsibility to patients. The narrative builds a sense of outrage as the reader learns about the lengths to which Johnson & Johnson went to maximize profits, even at the expense of vulnerable individuals. Gardiner Harris continues his investigation into Johnson & Johnson, revealing how the company aggressively pushed its drug Risperdal, even when it knew the drug could be harmful, especially to children and the elderly. The chapter focuses on the lengths J&J went to maximize profits, often at the expense of patient safety. It begins by highlighting a troubling trend. Increasingly, children with behavioral problems were being diagnosed with conditions like ADHD or conduct disorder and prescribed powerful antipsychotics like Risperdal. These drugs worked quickly, calming kids down, but also came with serious side effects. The author explains that J&J saw a huge financial opportunity in this trend. They estimated over $800 million in sales just from using Risperdal on children. To make this happen, the company funded studies to prove the drug worked for these conditions. However, Harris points out that the way these studies were designed made it easy to claim success. The measurements focused on reducing behaviors like talking back or being disobedient, things that naturally improve when a child is simply made sleepy or sick by the medication. Despite the potential for long-term health problems like weight gain, diabetes, and even heart issues, J&J pushed forward. Harris details the skepticism of FDA officials, who worried about the drug being used for behaviors that were simply annoying, not serious medical conditions. They even asked J&J to study how the drug might affect children's development, but the company refused. This refusal is a key example of the company prioritizing profit over safety. The narrative then shifts to the story of Austin Pledger, a young boy diagnosed with autism. His mother, Benita, sought help for his rages and challenging behaviors. The author illustrates how J&J's sales tactics targeted doctors like Austin's neurologist, Dr. Matheson. Sales representatives repeatedly visited him, providing free samples of Risperdal specifically sized for children. This aggressive marketing, Harris emphasizes, was a deliberate strategy to increase prescriptions. While Dr. Matheson initially reassured the Pledgers, and the drug seemed to help Austin's outbursts, he also warned about potential weight gain. The Pledgers proceeded, unaware of the full extent of the risks. Gardiner Harris then broadens the scope, showing a dramatic increase in bipolar disorder diagnoses in children during this period. He introduces Dr. Joseph Biederman, a Harvard psychiatrist who became a key figure in promoting the idea that bipolar disorder was common in young children. Biederman received significant funding from J&J, and Harris reveals a troubling connection. Biederman promised the company that research funded by them would lead to increased sales. This highlights a clear conflict of interest and raises questions about the objectivity of his research. The author details how Biederman's studies, though flawed, were widely published and influenced the field of psychiatry. He points out that these studies often lacked rigor and were based on questionable data. Despite this, they helped convince many doctors to prescribe antipsychotics to young children. Harris notes the alarm among some child psychiatrists who believed that too many children were being given powerful drugs unnecessarily. The chapter then turns to the issue of gynecomastia, the development of breast tissue in boys as a side effect of Risperdal. J&J conducted a study, RISINT41, that showed a significantly higher rate of this side effect than they had initially claimed. Instead of acknowledging the problem, the company manipulated the data, excluding certain patients and altering statistical analyses to downplay the risk. Harris describes this as a deliberate attempt to deceive doctors and the public. Harris explains that J&J continued to market Risperdal to the elderly, even after studies showed it increased the risk of stroke and heart attack in patients with dementia. The company suppressed this information and continued to promote the drug, prioritizing profits over the well-being of vulnerable patients. The author details how internal discussions revealed that J&J executives knew about the risks, but chose to ignore them. The narrative concludes by returning to Austin Pledger's story. While Risperdal initially helped manage his outbursts, he experienced significant weight gain and developed breast tissue. His mother, Benita, only learned about the potential for gynecomastia after hearing a commercial for a law firm suing J&J. This discovery led them to join a lawsuit against the company. Harris emphasizes that Austin's case is just one of many, and that J&J's actions had devastating consequences for countless individuals and families. The chapter sets the stage for further exploration of the legal battles and the full extent of J&J's misconduct. Gardiner Harris details a disturbing chapter in the story of Johnson & Johnson, revealing how a company once known for public trust engaged in deeply troubling and illegal practices. The chapter centers around the antipsychotic drug Risperdal and the lengths to which J&J went to maximize profits, even at the expense of vulnerable patients. In 2005, the Food and Drug Administration issued a strong warning about Risperdal, stating it increased the risk of death in elderly patients with dementia. This wasn't a surprise, as the drug already carried warnings about heart attacks, strokes, and diabetes, but it clearly signaled the drug wasn't safe for this group. Despite this, and the fact that Risperdal wasn't even approved for dementia, J&J continued to push the drug in nursing homes through a dedicated sales force. Harris explains that even after Gorski left a leadership position at J&J, the problematic sales tactics continued. The company didn't stop. Instead, it equipped its sales representatives with new talking points. These weren't about helping patients, but about protecting doctors from lawsuits. Representatives were told to assure doctors that it would be nearly impossible to prove Risperdal caused a death in an elderly patient, as it would be difficult to distinguish from natural causes. This is a chilling example of prioritizing profit over patient safety and attempting to shield doctors and the company from accountability. Even more disturbingly, sales reps were instructed to encourage doctors to diagnose dementia patients with schizophrenia, a condition Risperdal was approved for, even if the patients didn't have it. This allowed the company to legally market the drug to this vulnerable population. The author highlights the success of these unethical tactics. Risperdal's sales actually increased after the FDA warning, reaching billions of dollars. Harris points out that a significant percentage of nursing home residents still receive Risperdal and other antipsychotics, often with a schizophrenia diagnosis, simply to justify their use. He contrasts this with practices in other wealthy countries, where antipsychotic use in the elderly is far less common, suggesting a systemic problem within the American healthcare system. The narrative introduces Winston Smith, a former Lilly employee, who reveals that even their marketing of Zyprexa for dementia wasn't about helping patients, but about making life easier for nursing home staff. Harris emphasizes that J&J wasn't alone in these practices, but was the pioneer. Other companies like Lilly and Pfizer followed suit, leading to massive fines and guilty pleas. However, J&J consistently maintained a defiant stance, believing it had a right to market its products as it saw fit. The author details the company's attempts to downplay its wrongdoing, arguing that its marketing was based on symptoms rather than diagnoses, and that any issues were the fault of a few rogue employees. Harris reveals a disturbing pattern of J&J's legal strategy: fight every battle, delay any consequences, and protect its executives at all costs. The chapter culminates with J&J's guilty plea in 2013, but Harris stresses that the outcome was far from a complete victory for justice. No doctors who accepted bribes to prescribe Risperdal were charged, and no high-level executives faced criminal penalties. The author points to the revolving door between the Justice Department and law firms representing J&J as a significant obstacle to holding the company accountable. He suggests that prosecutors were hesitant to aggressively pursue charges against J&J executives, fearing it could damage their future career prospects. Harris concludes by highlighting the pervasive culture of prioritizing profit over ethics within J&J. a company that once prided itself on its integrity and commitment to public health. The author's detailed account paints a picture of a company that knowingly endangered vulnerable patients for financial gain and skillfully evaded full accountability for its actions. Section 6, Duragesic. Gardiner Harris details how Johnson & Johnson, a company many Americans trusted, played a huge part in the opioid crisis. It wasn't just about one bad drug like OxyContin. J&J actively worked to expand the market for opioids, even after it was clear they were dangerous and addictive. The story begins well before OxyContin, with J&J's Duragesic patch, a powerful fentanyl delivery system. Harris reveals that even before approving Duragesic, a company official, Dr. Curtis Wright, understood the patch could be misused, even fatally, but approved it anyway and later took a high-paying job with the company. This sets the stage for a pattern of prioritizing profit over safety. The author explains how J&J initially focused Duragesic on cancer patients, a limited market. However, when Purdue Pharma's OxyContin came along with its aggressive marketing, J&J saw an opportunity. They decided to promote Duragesic for everyday chronic pain, like back pain, knowing this would dramatically increase sales. Harris points out that J&J had already been laying the groundwork for this shift for years, funding groups that downplayed the risks of opioids and pushed for wider use. They funded organizations like the American Pain Society, influencing guidelines to make doctors more comfortable prescribing these powerful drugs. Harris emphasizes that J&J didn't just copy Purdue's tactics, they improved upon them. The author describes how J&J invested heavily in a special kind of poppy grown in Tasmania. This poppy, engineered by J&J scientists, produced much higher yields of the bane, a key ingredient in opioids like OxyContin. By controlling the supply of this ingredient, J&J became a crucial player in the entire opioid market, supplying both Purdue and other manufacturers. They even offered incentives to Tasmanian farmers to grow more poppies, turning fields of vegetables into poppy farms. The narrative details how J&J actively worked to discredit concerns about Duragesic's addictive potential. Even when the FDA warned them about misleading claims, they continued to tell doctors the drug was less addictive than other opioids. Harris explains that the FDA's system for tracking drug abuse, DAWN, didn't accurately capture fentanyl abuse, allowing J&J to falsely claim low abuse rates. The author highlights how J&J targeted doctors already prescribing high amounts of opioids, encouraging them to switch to Duragesic. Harris reveals a particularly troubling tactic: J&J's attempt to block generic versions of Duragesic. They sued the company trying to make a generic version, then launched a campaign to scare doctors away from it, claiming it was more dangerous. Ironically, J&J later switched to making a similar version of the patch themselves. The author underscores that J&J's actions weren't just about selling a drug. They were about maintaining a lucrative monopoly. The author concludes by emphasizing that J&J's role in the opioid crisis was arguably greater than Purdue's. While Purdue focused on OxyContin, J&J controlled the supply chain, influenced medical guidelines, and actively promoted opioids for wider use. Harris points out the irony of having a former J&J executive, Dr. Mark McClellan, lead an FDA review on addressing the opioid crisis, highlighting the company's ability to avoid accountability. The chapter paints a picture of a company that knowingly fueled a deadly epidemic for profit, skillfully avoiding public scrutiny, and maintaining its image as a trusted healthcare provider. Section 7, Ortho Evra Birth Control Patch. Gardiner Harris details a disturbing pattern of behavior at Johnson & Johnson, a company once known for safe and reliable products. For decades, the company generally tried to make sure its products were safe, but when problems arose after a product was already being sold, they often kept that information secret. Harris explains that it took a long time for dangers to come to light: 60 years for baby powder and asbestos, 20 years for Tylenol's risks, and a few years for drugs like Procrit and Risperdal. The company's reasoning was understandable. in a way. They had a lot invested in these products, and admitting danger could lead to lawsuits and ruin their business. However, Harris argues that something changed when Johnson & Johnson gained more influence over the Food and Drug Administration, FDA. The FDA is supposed to protect people by making sure medicines and products are safe, but it started relying on money from companies like Johnson & Johnson. This, Harris suggests, made the FDA weaker and allowed Johnson & Johnson to act more recklessly. Instead of discovering dangers and then hiding them, the company began to know about risks before releasing products and then deliberately lied to the FDA and the public. This is a huge difference. It wasn't just a mistake anymore, it was a conscious decision to put profits over people's safety. Harris illustrates this shift with examples like Retin-A and a glucose monitoring device. In both cases, Johnson & Johnson paid fines for wrongdoing, but the amounts were small compared to the money they made from the products. This lack of serious consequences made the company feel like it could get away with anything. By 2003, Harris reveals, the company was using illegal tactics like bribes and lies to get 6 out of its top-selling drugs approved. Ralph Larson, a former CEO, is presented as a key figure in this pattern. He made Tylenol incredibly successful, but also accepted risks that other companies wouldn't, and his leadership saw the company's value skyrocket. He was praised for doing well and doing good, but Harris suggests this was a false impression. The chapter then focuses on the birth control pill and how it actually changed the FDA, pushing it to demand more safety testing. This sets the stage for the story of Ortho Evra, a birth control patch developed by Johnson & Johnson. The patch was designed to be more convenient than a daily pill, and the company believed it could deliver hormones more effectively, potentially using lower doses. However, testing revealed a serious problem. The patch released significantly more estrogen into the bloodstream than the pill, and the amount varied widely from person to person. This meant a higher risk of strokes, blood clots, and even potentially unwanted pregnancies. Harris details how Johnson & Johnson deliberately misled the FDA about these findings. They used a correction factor to downplay the estrogen levels in their reports, without clearly explaining this manipulation to the agency. They also delayed sharing crucial study results and even presented altered data. The FDA, weakened and trusting, didn't catch these deceptions. The company launched Ortho Evra anyway, and sales soared. Soon, reports of serious injuries and deaths began to surface. Despite further studies confirming the patch's dangers, Johnson & Johnson continued to downplay the risks and manipulate data, even publishing misleading research. Harris emphasizes the tragic consequences of these actions, citing the deaths of young women like Zakia Kennedy and Stephanie Rosfeld. He concludes that Johnson & Johnson knowingly put thousands of women at risk for the sake of profit, demonstrating a clear and disturbing shift in the company's priorities. The author suggests that this pattern of behavior represents a fundamental change in the company's ethics, moving from reacting to problems to actively creating them. Section 8, Pinnacle Metal-on-Metal Hip Implant. Gardiner Harris details a troubling story of how Johnson & Johnson, a company many Americans trust, put profits ahead of patient safety with its medical devices, specifically hip implants. The chapter begins with the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, struggling to oversee medical devices. For years, the FDA allowed companies to make small changes to existing devices without rigorous testing, a shortcut called the 510(k) process. This was meant to be temporary, but the FDA never created a full list of devices needing thorough checks, leaving a loophole open for companies to avoid expensive and time-consuming trials. This lack of oversight created a situation where devices could be approved without proof they were safe or effective. Doctors often didn't even know these devices hadn't been fully tested. The relationship between the FDA and the medical device industry was also a problem. The FDA relied on money from the companies it was supposed to regulate, creating a conflict of interest. When smaller device companies tried to reduce funding to the FDA, Johnson & Johnson stepped in, offering financial support. This wasn't simply a good deed. The author suggests it was a strategic move to influence the FDA while the agency was reviewing concerns about Johnson & Johnson's own products, namely vaginal mesh and metal hip implants. The timing was critical. Johnson & Johnson faced potential lawsuits and recalls related to these devices. The company had allegedly lied about the safety of its products and even sold one without FDA approval. Harris explains that Johnson & Johnson's willingness to save the FDA was a way to protect itself from stricter regulations and legal consequences. Alex Gorsky, the head of Johnson & Johnson's device division, reached out to the FDA commissioner, and a deal was struck. Soon after, Gorsky requested a meeting with top FDA officials, framing it as a commitment to a good relationship and offering further support. The chapter then dives into the specific case of the Pinnacle hip implant. A J&J engineer discovered a flaw in the design just before submitting the application to the FDA. Fixing the flaw meant delaying the launch and potentially needing more extensive testing, which could have revealed the device's problems. The company faced a difficult choice: be honest and risk losing profits, or proceed with a flawed design and hope for the best. Harris reveals that the company chose the latter, submitting an application with inaccurate specifications. This is a crucial point, as it meant the FDA was approving a product based on false information. The story of the Pinnacle hip implant highlights a pattern of risky behavior by Johnson & Johnson. The company revived the idea of metal-on-metal hip implants, despite a history of failures with earlier versions. These implants used metal parts that could wear down and release toxic metal debris into the body, causing serious health problems. The author details how the company rushed the Pinnacle to market, ignoring warnings from its own engineers and scientists. They even considered bribing surgeons to use the implant and manipulated research studies to make the device appear safer than it was. Harris describes how Johnson & Johnson actively worked to downplay problems with the Pinnacle, even when evidence of failures emerged. They blamed surgeons for poor technique, suggested patients might have underlying health issues, and suppressed negative data. The company's internal documents reveal a cynical calculation. They were willing to profit from a flawed product, even if it meant harming patients. The author points out the irony that as the number of failed Pinnacle implants increased, Johnson & Johnson's sales actually went up, as surgeons ordered replacement parts from the company. The chapter concludes with a damning indictment of Johnson & Johnson's behavior. Harris illustrates how the company prioritized profits over patient safety, engaged in deceptive practices, and exploited loopholes in the regulatory system. The story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked corporate power and the importance of strong government oversight to protect public health. The author emphasizes that the FDA, rather than acting as a protector of consumers, had become too reliant on the companies it was supposed to regulate, referring to them as customers. Section 9, Prolift Vaginal Mesh. Gardiner Harris details a heartbreaking story of how Johnson & Johnson, a company many people trusted, put profits ahead of the health of women. The chapter centers on vaginal mesh, a medical implant used to help with bladder control and organ prolapse, a condition where organs slip out of place. Millions of women received these implants, hoping for a fix, but instead experienced terrible side effects. The story begins with Jill Messagen, a woman who shared her painful experience with a court. She described how the mesh caused her immense pain during intimacy and led to constant bleeding and urine leakage. Her story isn't unique. Over 100,000 women have come forward with similar complaints, resulting in nearly $8 billion paid out in settlements. Harris explains this case is a key example of Johnson & Johnson's troubling pattern of behavior. It wasn't the first time the company knowingly released a dangerous product. Previously, with the Ortho Evra birth control patch, J&J knew it delivered a higher dose of estrogen, but downplayed the risks to regulators. Similarly, with Pinnacle hip implants, the company reintroduced a design that had failed years earlier, again misleading the FDA. However, with vaginal mesh, the situation was different. Unlike those earlier cases, J&J didn't even bother to consult the FDA about the dangers, choosing instead to ignore potential problems. This demonstrates a growing disregard for safety, according to Harris. The author explains the underlying problem. As women age, muscles weaken, leading to organs shifting and causing issues like bladder leakage and discomfort. While there are treatments like exercises and supportive devices, surgery with mesh became popular in the 1990s as a seemingly quick fix. Initially, surgeons used a woman's own tissue, but it often didn't last. Plastic mesh, used for hernia repair, seemed like a good alternative. However, inserting mesh into the vagina proved problematic. The vagina is full of bacteria that can't be fully sterilized, creating a risk of infection. Also, plastic isn't flexible like vaginal tissue, causing pain and discomfort, especially during sex. Harris reveals internal documents showing J&J was aware of these problems early on. As early as 2000, surgeons were reporting mesh erosion and painful sex to the company. One surgeon even asked for guidance on how to remove the problematic mesh. Instead of addressing the issues, J&J executives actively suppressed information and discouraged research into removal techniques. A key figure, Dr. Yu Klinge, conducted research showing the body attacks the mesh as a foreign object, causing chronic inflammation and pain. He even suggested using a mesh with larger pores to reduce the reaction, but J&J ignored his advice because the cheaper, smaller pore mesh was more profitable. The story takes a disturbing turn when Harris describes how J&J rushed a new product, Prolift, to market. They hired a French team to develop a simpler insertion method, but the inventors themselves expressed concerns about the mesh shrinking and causing pain. Internal emails show J&J executives dismissed these warnings and launched Prolift, without FDA approval, a highly unusual move. Studies showed high rates of mesh protrusion and pain, yet J&J continued to sell the product. They even manipulated research and influenced medical societies to downplay the risks, as revealed in emails and a corrected study in the New England Journal of Medicine. Harris details how J&J prioritized profits over patient safety. They spent millions on marketing Prolift while allocating minimal funds to clinical research. When the FDA finally ordered studies, the results were damning. Prolift didn't work better than traditional surgery and caused significant harm. Despite this, J&J continued to sell the product until 2012, when they were forced to pull it from the market. The author emphasizes that J&J's actions weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern of prioritizing profits and concealing dangers. The company faced thousands of lawsuits and significant financial penalties, but Harris suggests the full extent of their wrongdoing remains to be uncovered. Section 10, COVID. Gardiner Harris details a public relations event in March 2021, where Johnson & Johnson's CEO, Alex Gorsky, stood with President Biden and a rival pharmaceutical executive to announce increased COVID-19 vaccine production. Harris reveals this wasn't simply a moment of national unity, but a carefully orchestrated attempt by both companies and the White House to improve their public image. For Biden, aligning with a historically trusted company like J&J offered a boost after a difficult start to his presidency. For Gorsky, it was a chance at redemption, especially considering his company was facing a growing number of scandals. The author points out Gorsky had previously distanced himself from President Trump and was seen as a leader of a respected corporation, making him a valuable ally for Biden. Harris then shifts focus to the troubling history hidden beneath J&J's polished exterior. He explains that while the vaccine announcement was meant to showcase J&J as a savior, the company was simultaneously battling lawsuits over opioids, baby powder contaminated with asbestos, faulty medical implants, and other dangerous products. The author emphasizes the sheer scale of these issues, noting thousands of lawsuits and billions of dollars in potential costs. This context reveals the irony of Gorsky standing alongside the president, presenting J&J as a force for good, while the company faced accusations of causing significant harm. Harris notes the company's attempts at public image repair, like redefining the role of businesses to focus on more than just profits, as a transparent effort to whitewash its past. The chapter details how J&J initially chose a manufacturing facility with a history of problems, Emergent Biosolutions, to produce its vaccine. An investigation by the New York Times exposed Emergent's shady practices, forcing a last-minute change of venue for the press conference to the White House. Harris explains that Emergent's issues were just one symptom of a larger problem: J&J's willingness to cut corners and prioritize profits over safety. The author highlights a pattern of concealing risks, downplaying dangers, and aggressively marketing products despite known problems. He uses the example of Risperdal, an antipsychotic drug, and how its illegal marketing contributed to health problems in nursing homes, potentially increasing vulnerability to COVID-19. Harris illustrates how J&J's reputation for trustworthiness allowed it to avoid serious consequences for years. The author points out that despite numerous lawsuits and scandals, the company remained highly ranked on Fortune's list of most admired companies. This demonstrates the power of public relations and advertising in shaping perceptions, even in the face of damaging evidence. The author notes the company's extensive lobbying efforts and financial contributions to regulatory agencies, suggesting a system designed to protect J&J from accountability. The narrative emphasizes that J&J's success wasn't just about creating good products, but about skillfully managing its image and influencing the systems that were supposed to hold it accountable. The author then dives into the development of J&J's COVID-19 vaccine, highlighting the work of Dr. Dan Barouch and his team. Harris explains the scientific process behind the vaccine, including the use of an adenovirus to deliver genetic material and train the immune system. While acknowledging the team's impressive work, the author underscores that the vaccine's development occurred against a backdrop of existing problems within J&J. The author details the challenges J&J faced with manufacturing, particularly the contamination issues at Emergent Biosolutions, and the eventual discovery that batches of J&J's vaccine were tainted with material from AstraZeneca's vaccine. Harris reveals that J&J's vaccine had a lower efficacy rate than those from Pfizer and Moderna, but its single-dose format offered convenience. However, the vaccine was soon linked to rare but serious blood clots, leading to a pause in its use and ultimately, its discontinuation. The author points out the irony of J&J being hailed as a COVID savior, while its vaccine faced safety concerns and ultimately failed to live up to expectations. Harris emphasizes that the company's history of prioritizing profits over safety contributed to these problems. The chapter concludes by detailing Gorski's departure as CEO and J&J's decision to spin off its consumer products division. Harris argues that this move was an attempt to distance the company from the liabilities associated with products like Johnson's baby powder. Despite the spin-off, the author asserts that J&J remains a powerful and influential company, shielded by its reputation and its ability to manipulate public perception. Harris suggests that the story of J&J is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked corporate power and the importance of holding companies accountable for their actions. He emphasizes the need for greater transparency and stricter regulation of the pharmaceutical industry, and a critical examination of the role of the FDA, which he portrays as being too closely aligned with the companies it regulates. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.